40 years ago today, the bodies of 3 Central Texas teenagers were found in a park on Lake Waco.
I'm innocent. The truth will come out someday. These were among the final words of David Spence.
I believe that David Spence was an innocent person who was murdered at the hands of the state.
Before Texas executed him in 1997 for the brutal murders of 3 teenagers.
They had been brutally stabbed, tortured, and sexually assaulted.
The case against him hinged on bite mark evidence and testimony from jailhouse informants, evidence that has since been thoroughly discredited. Most shocking of all, the lead homicide detective who built the case against Spence later came forward with a stunning admission. I do not think David Spence committed this crime. I am afraid the state of Texas executed an innocent man. By then it was too late. David Spence was already dead. This isn't fiction. This is the American justice system. July 13, 1982. A summer evening in Spiegelville Park on Lake Waco, Texas. 3 teenagers, Jill Montgomery and Raylene Rice, both 17, and Kenneth Franks, age 18, went to the lake for a night of swimming. They never returned home. The next morning, their bodies were discovered in a wooded area near the lake. All 3 had been brutally stabbed multiple times. The 2 girls had been sexually assaulted. Kenneth had been beaten severely. The medical examiner determined that they had been tortured before being killed. Marks on their bodies appeared to be human bite marks. The brutality of the crime shocked the community. Police were under intense pressure to solve the case quickly. For months, investigators had no solid leads. No murder weapon was found. No fingerprints matched any suspects. No eyewitnesses came forward. As weeks turned into months, public anxiety grew. The police needed a breakthrough. Then, 6 months after the murders, a new lead emerged. A jailhouse informant claimed that David Spence, a 26-year-old man already in jail on an unrelated assault charge, had confessed to the murders. Based primarily on this informant's testimony, David Spence was charged with capital murder. The case against David Spence rested on 2 main pillars: jailhouse informant testimony and bite mark evidence. 3 inmates claimed Spence had confessed to them while in jail. All 3 received significant benefits for their testimony: reduced sentences, special privileges, and in one case, $5,000 in reward money. Years later, all 3 would recant their testimony, claiming they'd been pressured by prosecutors and offered incentives to lie. The prosecutor's star witness was Dr. Homer Campbell, a forensic odontologist who claimed that bite marks found on the victims' bodies matched David Spence's teeth. Dr. Campbell testified with certainty. The bite marks on the victims were made by David Spence. The probability of someone else having made these marks is less than 1 in a million. What the jury didn't know: bite mark comparison was an unproven science with no statistical basis for such claims. Modern experts have since determined that such comparisons are fundamentally flawed. Spence maintained he was nowhere near Lake Waco on the night of the murders. Several witnesses were prepared to testify he was at home with his family. Other evidence contradicted the case against Spence. Hair found at the scene didn't match him. Blood evidence didn't match him. No fingerprints linked him to the scene, and he had no connection to any of the victims. In July 1984, David Spence went on trial for his life in McLennan County. The prosecution painted Spence as a sadistic killer who tortured and murdered the teenagers for pleasure. They claimed he'd been hired by a convenience store owner named Munir Deeb, who wanted to collect insurance money on one of the victims. The prosecutor told the jury, "The bite marks are like fingerprints. They prove beyond any doubt that David Spence committed these horrific crimes." Spence's court-appointed attorney had limited resources to challenge the bite mark evidence or investigate alternative suspects. After deliberating for just a few hours, the jury found David Spence guilty of capital murder. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Spence maintained his innocence. "I didn't kill those kids. I wasn't even at the lake that night." The judge sentenced him to death by lethal injection. As he was led from the courtroom, Spence turned to his mother and said, "Don't give up, I'm innocent." Marvin Horton was the lead homicide detective assigned to the Lake Waco murders. He spent months building the case against David Spence. Initially, Horton believed Spence was guilty. He testified at trial about the investigation and the evidence linking Spence to the crimes. But as the investigation continued, Horton began to have doubts. Evidence that didn't fit the prosecution's theory was ignored. Alternative suspects weren't pursued. Years later, Horton made a stunning admission. "I do not think David Spence committed this crime. Nothing from the investigation ever led us to any evidence that he was involved." Horton revealed that he had uncovered evidence pointing to other suspects, evidence that was never shared with the defense. "The more I investigated, the more I believed Spence wasn't involved. But by then, the prosecution had committed to their theory. They weren't interested in evidence that contradicted it." Troubled by the case, Horton eventually left the police force. Years later, he became one of Spence's strongest advocates, arguing publicly that Texas had executed an innocent man. For 13 years, David Spence sat on death row, filing appeals and maintaining his innocence. Each appeal was denied. The courts ruled that the bite mark evidence and informant testimony were sufficient to uphold the conviction. From prison, Spence wrote, "They're going to execute me based on junk science and the words of liars who were bribed to testify against me. How is this justice?" His mother, Juanita Wright, never stopped fighting for her son. "David wasn't perfect. He'd been in trouble before, but he didn't commit these murders. I know my son." Spence had a criminal record, arrests for assault and drug possession, but his family and supporters insisted he wasn't capable of the sadistic murders at Lake Waco. During the appeals process, new evidence emerged. All 3 jailhouse informants recanted their testimony. Other forensic experts disputed the bite mark evidence. Alternative suspects were identified but never investigated. In his final months, supporters gathered signatures for clemency, arguing that executing someone based on such flawed evidence was unjust. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles denied clemency. Governor George W. Bush declined to intervene. April 3, 1997, after 13 years proclaiming his innocence, David Spence's time had run out. For his final meal, he requested fried chicken, French fries, and Dr. Pepper. In his cell, he wrote a final statement to his family. "I am innocent. Keep fighting for the truth. I love you all." At 6 p.m., witnesses were seated, among them journalists, prison officials, and family members of both Spence and the victims. At 6:32 p.m., David Spence was led into the execution chamber. He was strapped to the gurney and IVs were inserted into both arms. When asked if he had any final words, Spence said, "I want you to understand I speak the truth when I say I didn't kill your kids. Honestly, I've not killed anyone. I wish you could get the rage from your hearts and you could see the truth and get rid of the hatred. I love you all. Love the Lord and find it in your hearts to forgive me." "Okay, Warden, I'm ready." At 6:45 p.m., the lethal injection began. At 6:56 p.m., David Spence was pronounced dead. Texas had carried out its 121st execution since reinstating the death penalty. In the years following Spence's execution, journalists and investigators continued to examine the case. In 2009, the National Academy of Sciences released a report concluding that bite mark comparison evidence was fundamentally flawed and had no scientific validity. At least 24 people convicted based on bite mark evidence have been exonerated through DNA testing. David Spence never got the chance for such testing. Dr. Michael Bowers, a leading forensic odontologist, said the bite mark evidence used to convict Spence would never be admissible in court today. It was junk science, plain and simple. All 3 jailhouse informants eventually recanted their testimony. One stated in a sworn affidavit, "I lied about Spence confessing to me. Prosecutors promised to help with my case if I testified against him." Perhaps most telling, Munir Deeb, the man prosecutors claimed hired Spence to commit the murders, was initially convicted and sentenced to death. But in a retrial, he was acquitted of all charges when the same evidence was presented to a different jury. Investigators have since identified other potential suspects in the Lake Waco murders, suspects with stronger connections to the victims, and histories of violent crime. These leads were never fully pursued. Since Spence's execution, Texas has put to death over 300 more people. How many were convicted based on similarly flawed evidence? Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia once claimed that there has not been a single case, not one, in which it is clear that a person was executed for a crime he did not commit. The words of Detective Marvin Horton directly challenge this claim. "I do not think David Spence committed this crime. I'm afraid the state of Texas executed an innocent man." Brian Pardo, a businessman who spent years investigating the case, said the evidence against Spence was manufactured. The real killers were never brought to justice. This case represents a complete failure of our justice system. David Spence was executed based on bite mark evidence, now considered junk science, and testimony from informants who later admitted they lied. The detective who built the case against him became convinced of his innocence. The alleged mastermind behind the murders was acquitted at retrial. Spence's last words included, "I speak the truth when I say I didn't kill your kids." The evidence suggests he may have been telling the truth. As Detective Horton put it, "If we executed an innocent man, we have not only failed David Spence, we have failed the victims, their families, and justice itself." This investigation took months of research, interviews with investigators, and examination of court records. If you believe in uncovering the truth behind America's most disturbing wrongful executions, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Next week, we examine the shocking case of Leo Jones, executed for the killing of a police officer, despite claims of a coerced confession, multiple witnesses pointing to another suspect, and serious doubts that were never fully investigated. Join our community demanding accountability from our justice system, because sometimes the truth emerges only after it's too late.